Terrific. So it's really great to have everybody here, and I'm really excited that we're all going to be part of this conversation. But I think we have somebody whose audio may be. Oops, I'm going to try to mute LC. Hi, LC. I just muted you, but you can unmute yourself, or I can unmute you at any point. So just let me know. But this pop-up was really prompted by a conversation that I had with one of our catalysts, Mike Taylor. And he and I had spent several hours talking about a particular project. And in light of that conversation, we really started to look at what happens when authority in the systems that we know that are authoritarian or patriarchal, if you may, start to dissipate. And there are just, numerous examples of that happening, as we speak. And one of the things we thought of is, what if you started to look at that from a complexity thinking perspective? So what I'd like to do is and then I'm going to turn it over to everybody who's on the call today, because that's really what Plexus pop-ups are about. It's just having this conversation and an opportunity to generate sort of collaborative thinking and say, hey, what does this mean? And what are some of the things that we can sort of take on to sort of next iterations or different kinds of inquiry? So, hi, Mark. Oh, as people join in, it's nice to see some familiar faces too. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me share the desktop. Okay. Yeah, let me see if I can just move this down. Okay, perfect. Okay, I hope everybody can see the desktop. Great. So let me see if I can move our pictures over here. Great, fabulous. So as we were starting to think about the shift in authority, oops, let's see if I can just, perfect. I hope you can all see this. We start to look at it from a systems and particularly from a complex systems perspective. And so I'm just going to go through this really briefly, because this isn't the total purpose of the conversation, but it will sort of hopefully frame where we go next. But if we looked at the systems, and this is just a working definition of the general definition of systems, and then more importantly, the systems that we can define as either mechanical or organic, we understand that when we look at mechanical systems, that there's an understandable linear process in which we can operate in them. And when we look at organic, they are clearly interconnected, interdependent, and continuously evolving. So this imagery lets us recognize that if we try to have our deepest social, economic, governmental systems operate like machines, the goal is to have linear relationships, to be able to build them and operate them from blueprints, have consistency and duplication. And many times when you think of hierarchical, patriarchal, or authoritarian systems, the underlying operating theory or mindset tends to come more from a mechanistic view. And I'm simplifying this, but we can have many examples, and maybe we'll discuss a few of them. But for all intents and purposes, they really do represent more of an organic perspective. And that's where we have nonlinear relationships, and it's holistic and emergent. And then the goal is adaptation. So when you think about a shift in authority and you're moving from knowable, easy to understand and operate in, and some folks would say that if we look at patriarchal or authoritarian systems, one of the things that we recognize is that there are rules and regulations, there are ways that we operate, and we sort of pretty much fall in line, if you may. Even though we may not always agree, but there are procedures and ways in which we operate in that system. Even if they're complicated authoritarian systems. But when they become complex, they're not fully knowable or reasonably predictable. And then if they are chaotic, they are neither knowable or predictable. Which leads me to this, and this is really where I wanted to get to. If anybody's familiar with the work of Ralph Stacey, who was really one of the early people to think deeply about, in these different types of systems, how organizations and people operate. And I've heard from several people that Ralph is not as excited about what is sometimes thought of as the landscape diagram. But what it does do is gives us a basis for conversation. And it does demonstrate the fact that known through unknown exist in a system at all times. So most importantly, if we are high certainty and predictability, and we're in high agreement. So I would consider that authoritarian systems are in that known sector, and I call it the lower left. So we have high agreement as to what we're going to do, who's in control, how we're going to operate. And we have high certainty about the predictability of what the actions and reactions in that system are going to be. And then as we move out through towards chaotic, there are actions and reactions and responses and experiences that change. So humans, and this was what really sort of predicated this whole conversation, was we like to operate, and we're not necessarily comfortable when we don't have enough structure and we don't have authority in which our basic operations and our basic systems, education, government, the economy, social systems, the agreements we have, the constructs we have in our communities, when they start to move from high certainty, predictability, high agreement, out through low certainty and predictability and low agreement, we become uncomfortable. And one of the things that we know is that there's a lot of change that happens in this chaotic. It's change that we don't have control. We don't even see it per se until it starts to emerge and move into the area where there's the complex system. And so the article and the conversation came with, okay, so the Me Too and Black Lives Matter and a number of these other movements, the Parkland student movement, they were really saying, we don't agree. We don't want to be in that simple known. We think that it's not the right place for us to operate. We're not in agreement with the rules and regulations and how we proceed here. But at the same time, as we start to move out, what are the other structures and what's the other assurances or guardrails that we could start to develop that will allow us not to be up here in this unknown chaotic where there are no rules, there are no regulations, and consequently there's no assurances that on a day in and day out basis we can operate effectively. So before I stop sharing, are there any questions about this particular slide or anything that you'd all like to jump in on?
Yeah, this is Mark. I'd like to ask a question, which is, before the economic crisis in 2008, I think there was high agreement that, the economy was okay, things were moving in an okay direction, and people perceived that they could predict things. But the underlying structure, which people didn't understand, really was much more complex.
Mm-hmm.
When you mean certainty, predictability, agreement, do you mean people's perception of it or the reality of the situation? In other words, when the Soviet Union fell, I don't think you could find one expert who felt that that was going to happen. And so there was a high degree of predictability by the experts and a high degree of agreement that, you know, it wouldn't all come collapsing down. So how do you, I'm trying to understand whether this model is about agreement or about reality. Because reality and what people perceive is very different.
Oh, I think that's an absolutely terrific question, because that's probably at the crux of everything that we try to do when we work with complex systems, and certainly with human complex systems. If you think of, and anyone else can jump in after I answer this briefly, if you think of the fact that in authoritarian systems, there are literally rules, regulations, ways in which to operate. So using your example, the deviation from what the government wanted and how people operated were, you know, not accepted. And if they started to change, that was sort of an underground movement. And so everybody felt that they had an understanding of how everybody was going to operate. And as we all know, when we work in complex systems, that the individuals or the agents in the system have the right and will, over the course of time, start to take actions which allow them to align with what they need, what they want, and in many cases where they're feeling perturbed or uncomfortable. So when you start to, without getting too deep into the science of it, when you start to feel that people are not comfortable with the rules and the regulations, then they stop acting and they stop agreeing in that, you know, within those known structures. And they may move a little bit out toward the, you know, toward, I will call, the lower certainty, predictability, and the lower agreement. And small movements may move into the complex area where they're starting to make small changes in the system. But at the point in time where there is, everybody is moving toward the complex system, and to the point where there is no replacement rules and regulations or structures in which to operate under, then you find that during that time period where they're trying to find stability, they're trying to find a place where they can start to operate again, knowing, well, if we do this, this is what's going to happen to some high degree of predictability. You find that there's chaotic notions. So for example, and I don't mean this to be political, but if we start to move away from a number of these very authoritarian and known, you know, sort of global organizations, the UN or NATO, we don't have immediate replaceable systems that will give either the economic, the social, and clearly our relationship with other countries, a high degree of comfort in how we're going to act and how everybody is going to find their new place within the system. Does that answer it a little bit? Does anybody else have any other examples or want to jump in?
Well, I think it doesn't quite answer, but let me postulate something. You and I can sit there and say we agree and it's high predictability, but our behaviors may not show that agreement. In other words, we had certain rules about how the economy is going to work, but people were violating those rules right and left, which created the instability. So I think the word agreement may have a different meaning in the sense of there's a consensus among people that things are working okay when the behavior, so in some sense, you have to look at the behavior rather than the public pronouncements. You see what I'm saying? You and I may agree, but we may be behaving in ways that are not agreeable. And I think that in some sense is the difficulty about this, because everybody thinks we're all in agreement, but underlying it. So, you know, everybody thinks that the Republicans love free trade, okay? But we found out under Trump that there was a huge shift in the Republican Party. They didn't agree that there was free trade was good. So all of a sudden, what was agreement really turned out years before not to be agreement, but people didn't know it. So I think there's a difference in behavior, and that's the tricky part, because everybody thinks we're all in agreement and the rules are being behaved and all that, and nobody's looking at the behaviors carefully enough to know that the system is really not in agreement.
Precisely. I think that's absolutely right on. And that goes back to the first few slides that I showed you, which were, if we looked at the system as a mechanical system, where we knew precisely if something broke, we would be able to replace it or update it, and then it would work again. But when it's not a one-to-one relationship in the system, and we know that we can't necessarily guarantee or we can't fix it to have the outcomes be consistent and predictable. And from a behavioral standpoint, with complex human systems, that is the underlying energy that can start to shift. So when we talk about emergence, if there is enough disagreement or enough movement from that certainty and agreement, then you can find that you're going to start to really shift the behaviors on a broader basis within the system. So the example of we may be doing things in agreement, and at some point, some people use the term tipping point, but at some point in time, enough is enough. And then the behavior, there's enough dissidence and disagreement within the system for the behavior to start to change and potentially to influence even those hierarchical and authoritarian systems. So for me too, there's a huge amount of debate about whether, social media, the, awareness and the actual actions that, companies and, organizations and people are, saying this is no longer acceptable, if that will change the behavior throughout the entire culture and the system. That's way above my pay grade. But I do think that what it has done is it has an awareness that now there is going to be a different level of accountability, and a number of people who thought they had the authority to, to operate and act in a way that is not acceptable, because there are so many people who say this is not an acceptable way to act, may change their behavior. And at some point in time, if the Me Too movement really does shift how different genders react to each other, then I think that would be the perfect example of it moving from that area where, even though it wasn't necessarily explicit or said that people in power could take advantage of people who are not in power, those particular behaviors, that sort of patriarchal approach to things, will shift. And one of the questions I have for everybody, and really do want to hear other people's voice, and I'm going to mute myself, is how do we start to think about what we replace it with? Do we change corporate governance? Do we start to have very public and discernible rules and behavioral patterns that people need to follow? Are the I'm trying to think of the word, but the consequences of having that inappropriate behavior, do they become so widespread within the culture and within an organization that people absolutely don't do it? And I mean, if you think about how so many things that we thought, we just took for granted, or we didn't recognize and talk about, are now starting to surface. So I'm going to mute myself. If anybody else would like to jump in, please feel free to do so. Nancy, we're not hearing you right now. as Nancy's looking to, oh, Nancy? Would somebody else like to jump in as Nancy's trying to figure out the audio?
Somebody's talking and I can hear.
Pardon me, Mark?
And I can't hear.
Okay, can you hear me, Mark, now?
I can hear you.
Okay, yes, I can't hear Nancy, and I apologize. Let me see, I don't.
Maybe she has
Do you want to try it now, Nancy? I just muted and unmuted you. No, we're not hearing you at all. I'm so sorry, because we heard you earlier. Would somebody else like to just jump in for a moment? Shirley, I see you, so I'm going to ask you if you'd like to. Maybe we can hear you.
Sure.
Okay.
This is so, my head is just kind of spinning, which is probably not good when I'm driving, so I decided to pull over so I could really listen more carefully. I think one of the challenges that I would like to respond to your most recent comment is that as we move from a mechanical system to a more complex system, how do we create opportunities for people to begin to feel more comfortable? You know, some of us are very willing to take those risks and live with uncertainty and appreciate uncertainty, and others are not. And until everybody's at that same speaking point where they're ready to move forward with uncomfortableness, then it's hard to make progress. And what do you think about helping people feel more uncomfortable?
Hi, Deborah. Would you like to jump in? And thank you, Shirley. Appreciate it. Thank you for this is a huge topic, and I do think I think even if we focused on, so if you start to live if you start to recognize the existence of that uncertainty, and it becomes something that has a higher level of awareness. You may have discomfort, you may not like something, but as it progresses and you find that it becomes more disturbing, or as according to that chart, if you move farther from personal agreement or as group agreement, and don't understand what the consequences are going to be, if you say, I'm not going to accept that anymore, I'm not going to operate under those, I say structures or rules and regulations, it does become more difficult. And it's, as humans, as I said, we really like and appreciate the fact that we have a reliability on authority, and that our largest social and governmental and economic systems are really highly reliable. And one of the things I say is you don't want to operate anywhere but in that lower corner. If you are on a plane, you want the air traffic controllers and that entire system to be so close to agreement and so close to predictability that when you get on the plane, you're not concerned that people are going to start making their own choices, or that things are not going to be able to support that. And when I help people sort of understand that, they go, you're right. And that's a very, air traffic controllers, the whole airline transportation is a very complex system of which there's lots of humans interacting. And it's almost miraculous when you think about the fact that it does operate as efficiently as it does. But when it goes back to Mark's, feeling, the concept of behaviors, where it does become become a stronger sense of what our value systems are and how we're comfortable living and operating within our sort of social groups. That does start to be, what I've often said is messy. And when it gets messy, that's where people get uncomfortable. And that's where, as you start to change the system, which these movements are doing, as you start to change the system, people, in some ways, they think of, let's close our eyes and let's go back to something where we don't have to think about it. And that's really simplifying the conversation. But you're right. Yes.
The thing that I also feel very cautious about is either we go back to something that's more familiar, or we jump into something that we really don't know enough about to jump into. And I'm working on a project that I think is just so beautifully matched with what you're talking about today. And I'm thinking, how do I help people be more comfortable with messiness and to value the process of messiness? And it's simple for me in my head because I'm okay with that, but I don't know how to help others learn how to do that or appreciate that more. So I'm really kind of looking for strategies or continued conversation about how do we get okay with messy, and when is it time to stop being okay with messy? Maybe this is more of a martini conversation as opposed to a problem-solving conversation.
Well, I'll jump in on. I like the metaphor of air traffic controllers, which being in healthcare systems, the hierarchy. You do want a lot of control when you're in surgery, but you want to empower everyone in the system to know where they're at if it's out there in a social context that maybe you need to put your seatbelt on. There's a continuum of hierarchy that needs to be in place so that one can be messy and thrive. And that's like in a business model, from a hierarchy to a collaborative to an agile model, where everyone is empowered to see the same situation through their lens, and then actually knowing what they know and knowing what they don't know. And so that we're always trying to empower not everyone to be airline pilots or neurosurgeons, but having the understanding of what they know and what the other people don't know. And that is where that's where I think things like the new businesses thrive, because they empower their organization to be agile and to see how they can evolve over time with their never-changing rules. But then the last thing, like 2008, or when we had somebody came up that, we can use double derivatives to leverage a lot of complexity, and no one was saying, well, no, that rule, we need a few rules about leveraging huge amount of money with the second derivative, and no one even knowing that they're doing it. So knowledge keeps growing, and empowering people to see that is important.
So I'd like to respond, because I'm in the air traffic. I used to be in the air traffic design business, and one of the fascinating things that happened was that even though the airlines had reached a pretty high level of safety, they weren't satisfied. So they created safety teams. And what they did is they allowed people to say when they had made a mistake or when there was a problem without punishment, okay? So they had a big database. Not only that, they had a safety culture in which multiple people, the baggage handler, the guy who drives the truck, the pilots, everybody got together once a month or so to throw out ideas. So they still lived within a hierarchy, but what happened is they brought in people. So they moved away from a punishment culture. Obviously, controllers still had the requirement to keep planes 5 miles apart, and there was a detection system if you didn't. So, it's not like every action is okay? But there was a series of actions that You know, like sometimes if you drive and you change lanes and you don't see the other car, you can report that without being punished. So there's moved away from a punishment culture, and this is a very key aspect. In our mechanical systems, we punish failure drastically, or in hierarchical systems. So in the Me Too movement, you know, actually the victim would be punished. Now, if you move away from the punishment model to a dialogue model, to a discussion, then new norms can develop and people can feel safe. So I think one of the things that has to happen is we have to find that line between what's unacceptable and what is acceptable in terms of mistakes. What happens in both hierarchical systems is people feel very frightened to say anything about the hierarchy. And that stifles. So I think this is a very fundamental aspect of collaboration and safety within an organization. And I'm seeing that changing in lots of organizations. In fact, there's some organizations that actually give awards for people who have failed. Because they're saying, hey, if you don't try something really exciting and wonderful, then we're not going to make much progress. So, you know, I think this is a very key aspect of how we can get further into the complex systems, to make people feel comfortable that, yes, we're in a hierarchy and here are the rules that you can't violate, but you know what? If mistakes occur, if you're not in that zone, we'll be okay. That's my 2 cents.
I really appreciate that that thought. I recently read a book called Poke the Box, and it talks about how being willing to take risk and not being punished for taking risk. And I tell you, that simple little, half-hour read has really changed my perspective on how I want to be involved in the organizations that I'm in. And I have become much more of a risk taker, calculated risk, of course, but a much more of a risk taker. So thank you for bringing that up.
This is Nancy. Can I try again and see? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, good for you, Nancy.
Pardon?
Good for you. We can hear you.
Oh, good. All right. I want to come at it from a little bit different angle. I think there is in all countries a real disillusionment with authority in general. And I think it comes from things like the VW crisis, or their bad behavior around the fuel things. It comes from us seeing priests who we've looked to, seeing that they are sexual abusers. It comes from senators that we're discovering, and even our heroes like Charlie Rose and so forth are doing really very inappropriate things. Wells Fargo. There's so many examples right now of really bad behavior of people who we look to as authority or as guidance or as and I think that leaves us in a place where we are feeling like we have to. What I see happening, I think, in reaction to that, is that more organizations are moving toward participation, whether it's through Agile or whether it's through Freestyle Inquiry or something else. They're moving more away from thinking that the authority, that the CEO has it right, because we now know they often aren't working in our best interest. So moving away from that to saying we need more dialogue, we need more participation, we need more people involved in the decision making. We don't want to, we're not going to trust authority. We want to trust the collective. That's the movement that I see happening. Anyone else see that? Or I'd be interested in anyone else thinking about that.
Well, Nancy, this is Shirley again, and what makes me think about, and I mean no disrespect to anyone, and it's kind of the elephant in the room, that for so long and for so often authority has always been male dominated. Yeah. And so I think until there's some ownership of that and some recognition of that, then it's going to be a little bit more of a painful shift from moving away from authority or redefining what authority means. And many times we don't have that really hard discussion. And so that's what comes up for me with what you said. I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Yeah. And let me just say, Shirley, because I saw you were in Topeka, I just need to tell you that I grew up in Lawrence.
Well, you're lucky. What a great place to grow up.
It was, yeah.
Go Jayhawks.
right down the road from Topeka.
Absolutely.
This is Mark. I want to create a hybrid model because I don't think our world can exist on a New England style participatory model where decisions are made at the lowest level all the time. I think it's impossible. So take our air traffic control system again. You know, I don't want controllers to feel like they have the option to decide what they want and spend, you know, try to get everybody on the same page to change the rules. That's different from participation. So I think what often happens in organizations is that there is inadequate participation from all the stakeholders. So we're stuck in a paradigm that often doesn't work. And the CEO, but I think we can't move to a situation where every decision is sort of decided by a consensus buildup. And I think where we're struggling with is where is that balance? And so I move towards the concept of more participation and more transparency, and more security in terms of bringing up issues. But I'm not so sure I move in the direction of what I call, you know, decision making always gets done on a consensus basis.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with that. I think there are, you know, Ron Heifetz, who's at Harvard, has written about this issue, and he talks about technical issues and adaptive issues, and that it's around adaptive issues that we need the dialogue. But there are technical issues that we need to simply have someone who is technically expert to deal with those problems. So I think that division is really important, and I agree we can't bring people together to solve every single problem. But it does seem to me that when the problems are about how I'm going to be impacted or how my work is going to be impacted, then I would like to participate in that discussion.
Yes,
I don't know. I don't know that I have to. I don't even want to call it a decision, but I want to participate. That I want my voice to be heard if it impacts me.
Absolutely, that's the key for me.
Yeah,
and feel safe in that process. You see, I think that's often where things go wrong. Is I had a boss who once said, "I want you to come to me when you have a real concern." So I came to him, and I got blown out of the water. I mean, I really got hurt by that.
yeah.
I was talking to a friend, somebody high level in the organization. She said, "And you really believed him?" It was like, his behavior was his words were one thing, but his behavior was not another. So, I'm not willing to go to him again and tell him where I think things, where things are better. So the behaviors of an organization have to truly match stated desire to have people participate. And oftentimes
one thing that Denise, you presented was, and I did a program here in a community I live in, is the difference between the mechanistic or the rules of like an organization and the self-organizing interactions of one's thinking and the culture that we're in. And, breaking, I thought that was great what you showed, of breaking apart the self-organizing patterns of the organic and then the mechanistic things that we have that like roads and bridges and all kinds of structure and technology that allow us to function safely and productively. And not to separate the two, but be aware of the difference in the mechanisms that are involved and how we we really do try to limit the amount of surprise in our world. And that becomes a huge lever point for hierarchy to maintain the status quo because it's worked in the past. But that's not how you build a job or an organization that comes out with a new widget or the new cure for a certain disease. So, and those are the things that are going forward. So it becomes to empower the individuals on the new ways that we see how we work as individuals and as a culture in a self-organizing fashion. That, okay, but we can even intentionally take ourselves to self-organizing criticality or a tipping point and be aware of when it happens. So that then is empowering for the whole culture to see when that tipping point happens.
Exactly. Thank you. And so as you were all speaking, and if somebody else wants to jump in, please feel free to do so. We love to hear everybody's voices and ideas. But what has really sort of come to the surface for me, and this may go back to your question, Shirley, about how can you be more comfortable with the messiness, is not to simplify this too much, but to have people understand what the underlying properties are of how people and organizations operate. So although there may be places where they do need to have that very high mechanistic area, and they exist in every system we're part of, but where you're going to be able to get new ideas, where you're going to be able to engage in feedback that will change the things before they become a crisis, has to do with the underlying principles of a complex system. And so there are, a number of really wonderful ways that people are looking at this. But I've been thinking that we need to really elevate that conversation and find ways that people are starting, even before they come into a meeting, that they give some sort of foundational principles about, if you're feeling like you're not getting your feedback and you're feeling like your voice isn't heard, or what will the outcomes of this meeting, how does it fit with other things that are happening in the organization? And I know that that's really, broad strokes, but I think that there's an opportunity to have sort of these conditions for engagement that would let people understand that what happens during a meeting or a big project is going to have consequences across other parts of the organization, and maybe most importantly within the relationships between the people that are working together. And so I don't know if anybody has any ideas, or they think that's something that we should continue having conversations around. And it's not just about change management, and it's not just about having open engagement and dialogue. I think it has to do with something with understanding the overall properties of complex systems and that's how organizations are working, even if somebody doesn't even mention that. So for anyone who hasn't already jumped in, are you sure you wouldn't like to? Nancy, go ahead.
Well, name one or two of those principles that you're thinking of, Denise.
That's great. I think people are typing in here, but I really appreciate that question. So if you start to shift how people are rewarded in a system, so if you, to go back to the example of rewarding people who are doing experiments and who are coming up with ideas that may not necessarily fall into the normal procedures or processes, but allow people to engage at a different and deeper level. So if I come up with a lot of ideas, or I give feedback throughout the project on an active and meaningful basis, that has a different level of reward, and consequently I can feel that my contributions are better. That's one way to sort of operate within a different kind of engagement. I actually think simple rules, which is one of the things that we think a great deal about. So if you say that here are the simple rules in which we operate everything in this group or project. And if we all understand them and talk about them, then we've begun to appreciate what we need to bring and what the system will support us in doing. That's another way. I've also come to the point where it really depends on the project and group, but I like to offer an understanding of what is a complex adaptive human system. And, 2 or 3, not the slides I showed you, but 2 or 3 slides. I do use the, the metaphor of the machine and the garden, and then sort of explain how the actions we may take if we were a mechanic are infinitely different than the actions we would take if we were a gardener. Doesn't mean that gardeners aren't PhD master gardeners who understand and work within plans, have great depth of knowledge and ability to, soil analysis and plant composition and everything. But at the same time, there needs to be this capacity and ability to recognize that despite the best plans, things may not always work out. So what do we do when our project isn't going the way it needs to go? Or we all recognize that something is not proceeding as needed, or the outputs are not what we expected. So understanding that takes the onus off of the individual feeling that they're uncomfortable and can't articulate why. And at the same time, it gives everyone this ability to recognize that there are underlying forces that are continually generating new information, that the actions that are being taken at one part of the organization do have consequences in another part of the organization, despite how separate or siloed they may be. And it's an awareness. I think if there was one thing, it's an awareness, and being able to just have the distinction between the mechanistic parts of the system and the complex adaptive parts of the system goes a long way in starting to develop that awareness. I think there's language, there's distinctions, there's different ways and different actions that people can take. I'm not sure if that answered it, Nancy.
Denise,
Yes, that was helpful, and it goes back to the discussion we had whenever it was around simple rules too.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And one of the things that we've all been working at in the Plexus network is developing this concept of complexity thinking, which doesn't necessarily mean you need to know every detail and the science and the theory behind, it's really wonderful terms and operations and functions of complexity and fields of complexity. But there's this difference in thinking about things. And, that becomes very helpful when you're in conversation and you can't find a way to describe or to share the distinctions between what everyone planned to have happen and what is actually happening. And that, if you can start to have that kind of conversation or feel comfortable in order to share that different level of awareness with the team or the group, I think that helps. Simple rules works very effectively because it gives you, here's some guidance on how we're going to work together, and people can continually do references back to it. And if one of them is we bring every tool that we have to our work together. If somebody happens to be a graphic designer, that's a tool that they're going to bring. And that may give us new awareness, new ways to think of problem solving, new ways to share the work and the outputs that we're moving toward. And that may not have been the normal procedures or ways that people would work, but it gives you the freedom and the invitation to participate in a way that you can contribute. That also brings different thinking into the process. It also brings a different skill and capacity to the group. And all of that works if you've offered that opportunity to the individuals who are participating.
Well, Denise, Come on. Denise, this is
Yes.
Mark. I want to make a plug for my project. And the project is outcome management and complexity. And what we're trying to do in this project is to take people's experiences with complexity thinking and how it's changed the outcomes of how things work in an organization, and write basically chapters on each of those experiences, and then try to summarize what is common about those experiences. We've got about 7 or 8 people working on this. It's starting up on June 22nd. So I'm going to put in my email, and if anybody's interested to participate, what we're trying to do is get people not to start with the theory, you know, this is what it is, but to, you know, to really talk about stories in which big things, which they found success with the way of rethinking how they operated an organization. So, for example, even before I knew about complexity theory, I worked on a project in which I got everybody involved and I had participation. I did all kind of the right things, and miraculous things happened in this project, which still amazed me to this day. And it was only later that I discovered that I was applying complexity principles of management. So what we're hoping is to have a set of stories that really illustrate that, and then try to figure out, hey, what's common about these stories? So I'll put my email on the chat, and if anybody's interested.
Mark, I really love that idea. I want to hear more stories. So I'm excited that you're doing this work. This is awesome.
Okay. Well, I'm going to join. I would love to join.
Yes, I will certainly ponder that for sure. I do have my no button on my desk, but this may be one time I don't have to hit the no button.
Okay. Well, if you're interested, I'm putting my email in, and just send me an email that you might be interested. And it doesn't mean a big commitment. It might be that you're just interested in telling a story, and somebody else will write it down. You know, I don't want to make this like everybody has to do a huge amount, but let's say you had a story that you want to tell, and I could hear it and write notes and write it up for you because you don't have the time. Okay?
Thank you. I'd like to just refer to 2 questions. I hope that you all have been reading the questions in the chat box, but one that I think would be a great one for us to wrap up on is that the question from Jennifer, and the question for the group is, as systems are restructured, what are ways to bring in the participation and voices of people of color, LGBTQ, and other groups that historically have been left out of the conversations, but whose concerns might be drowned out by consensus? Does anybody want to give a shot at answering or thinking about that? And I think that's really true. Those, that's probably, you know, at the core of being able to create, you know, that diversity of thought, ideas, and collaboration. I'm going to say my first thought was to continually be aware of creating opportunities for people across the system or the organization to come together, so that the invitation is as broad as possible. And then once the invitation is you know, sort of distributed, that when you do come together, you use something like simple rules or rules of engagement, so that everybody's voice and ideas are heard. And then you just need to be persistent about that. But if anyone else has an idea, please jump in before we conclude. It's a great way to conclude.
Denise, I'd like to add one more thing to what you just brought up. I think in the project that we've been working on, really coming to the table with a sense of cultural humility, I think really opens the door to bring in voices that have not traditionally been heard. And that has been really, really successful for us. We don't have any idea how it happened. We still think it's a miracle. I'm hoping you all can help us figure out what happened. But that made a huge difference in the populations that we're working with, and how to invite others to the table.
I'm going to ask Shirley, and then have everybody who wants to have a final comment. I'd like to invite you to maybe share a little bit of your work, if you can, and the groups you're working with in a future pop-up, so that we can look at what are the different ideas and what are you doing that would inform the work that we're doing, and then share back to you. So I think that might be a really cool way in which to sort of anchor ourselves around something specific if you're up for it.
Are you asking me to do that now?
No, not now, but
Okay.
future pop-up. No, I'm not
Oh
gonna
yeah.
ask.
Oh yeah.
I was going to say,
I was going to say now. It's like, oh my gosh, where's my no button? But yes,
Right.
a future pop-up would be really lovely, because it's not that I feel like I need to boast about anything. Our project is amazing, and we don't know how we got to amazing. And so having some feedback from people who don't know about the project, I think would really help us move things to the next level, and figure out how we keep that going.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for that opportunity, and I'm certainly open to continued conversation about that.
Perfect. And I hope that you put your email, I'm sure you have, in the
Yes.
in the chat, but that's terrific. So thank you. Yay. This is why these conversations are so important. And no, I would not have made you go through it now at the side of the road. So thank you. Is there anybody else? We'll look at the chats. You all will have opportunity to look at the other questions, and we have everybody's address in here, and it would be really terrific to keep this conversation going. So we're going to have a follow-up, and yes, we already have someone who's going to be sharing a case and their work with us, so that's really terrific. I really appreciate there were so many new people here that I don't know, and so please feel free to jump into the network. The way we work, we're a volunteer network. We really help support each other with ideas and projects. And there's a tremendous amount of resources. If you really want to get deep into the woods about any complexity, concepts, thinking, or research, you probably could find it at Plexus, or there's somebody who can direct you to it. So thank you very much. I'm really excited to have been part of this conversation. Any final comments from anybody?
Just for the project, if you have really good stories like I just heard Shirley have, I mean, you don't even have to be a big figure, but I really want to document stories, because I think cultures change a lot by stories, not by all the statistics and all that. I mean, people read things and they get tired of statistics, but they hear great stories about miraculous projects that occurred, or I'm watching NPR and I'm seeing how solar energy is affecting villages in Africa, and I'm just excited by how the story is illustrating how new ways of operating really are creating miraculous changes. So once people feel that way, then maybe they'll change their behavior.
Perfect. So I am going to stop the recording, and we post all of our recordings on